So then our subject is the Huguenots, and we'll go pretty well straight into it. I will just mention this Bible, which was given to me a few months ago, and it is a Huguenot Bible dating from 1686, I think it is. So it's quite an interesting example, so I thought I'd bring it along to set the scene this morning. Now, we'll begin as like this. France in the 16th century was, like quite a number of other European countries at that time, sharing in the general religious unsettlement, you may say, and upheaval of the times that we call the Reformation. The Roman Church, to set the background very briefly, was wealthy, it was powerful, it was a political movement. And in comparison with the churches that are recorded for us in the New Testament, well, it was very different indeed. It was largely corrupt. And there was a growing awareness amongst many that the church had very much departed from the pattern that is laid down for us in the New Testament and so on. Not that every single individual in the medieval church was corrupt, I need to say that, but generally that was the case. So in France, Germany, England and other places, there was a growing tension at that time. Part of the tension was between the secular rulers who were becoming impatient about the interference of the Pope in Rome into secular affairs. In France, on the eve, as it were, of the Huguenots, the king was Francis I. Those who are keen, and we all should be, readers of Calvin's Institutes, you see the preface, the dedication at the beginning is dedicated to Francis I. Now, the situation in France then was something like this. The king, that's Francis I, had come to exercise a very, very large control over the church. He vied with the Pope at that time. The Pope was Leo X. And so there was some tension here, but you have to be able to see and notice to understand this unfolding story that any attack on the church at that time in France was also seen as an attack upon the king. So those two things were closely aligned in that respect. Then another aspect would be this, the French Parliament. There was a parliament, it wasn't as strong as the king, but it had an influence. The parliament in France at that time, like the Inquisition in Spain, the Spanish Inquisition that we've all heard of, had in its powers the power to suppress heresy. And that parliament did go about to try and suppress heresy. And it said that they were no more humane in their treatment of heretics than the cruelest inquisitors of Spain. But then there was another powerful body in France at that time, and that was, of course, the University of Paris. That was divided up into various departments, and what we now call the Sorbonne was the theological department, the theological faculty of the university. It had no official powers in one sense, but its authority was very great. People listened to it, it held sway. And it was referred to often in regard to heresies and whether these were heresies or not, and so on. The university was very very sort of, what you would say, patriotic to the country of France. And it too was somewhat jealous of papal interference of its affairs and so on. So there were these tensions. Scholasticism, of course, was part of the teaching, the method of teaching at that time, and we all know about scholasticism, some good aspects to it, but largely it was a profitless tradition in many respects. These were the three powers, really, that we have to have in mind when we're thinking about the Huguenots, we may say the Reformation. But there's also another movement abroad at that time, and that is the Renaissance. We know about the Renaissance. There's a lot you could say about the Renaissance. In the southern areas of Europe, the Renaissance was really, in some respects, an excuse for loose living and so on. But in the north, it had a more serious aim and aspect to it. And we know that some of the great translations of the Bible came about through that movement and so on. But the Renaissance in France wasn't too keen on the growing Lutheranism that was now coming on the scene. And some of the leaders of that movement in France said that it should be extirpated, and adding this, by fire rather than reason. So I'm painting a picture of all that these Huguenots had to come up against. Out of the Renaissance came some attempts, even within the Roman Church, at a kind of a reformation, but it was soon squashed, and it came to nothing. Francis I was, he said, a child of the Renaissance, and he was open to new ideas, and he was at that time in a political alliance with Protestant Germany. So you can see why Calvin had hopes that he would support the Reformation movement, and why he dedicated the preface to the institutes in that manner. So we may say all that by way of introduction. Now, all types of religious heresy at this particular point in France were regarded as Lutheranism. They saw it as something coming in from the outside. But then you imagine them waking up with some alarm to the fact that there was one or some within their own country that were following Reformation lines. And of course, that was John Calvin, born Noyon, Picardy, 1509, and for a while also studied at the University of Paris and so on. And so we may say also at the beginning that French Protestantism was from very early on rooted in Calvinism. And the Huguenots were really Calvinists. Some people ask, where does the name Huguenot come from? Well, the simple answer to it is nobody knows. But there have been various ideas as to where it comes from. Some say it refers to people who walk about by night. Well, that gives the inference that it was a secret movement and so on. Others say it comes from the word, or French word, confederates, bound by an oath, almost like a secret society. Some say it comes from Switzerland. There was a political leader by the name of Benenzio, or if I pronounce it right. And some say it was derived from that. Others say it derives from the idea of people that worshipped at home. But so the list goes on. So the Huguenots. Calvin preached the total authority of Scripture in all aspects of life. He was a great preacher, we know, of the sovereignty of God. Grace alone was the method of salvation, grace through faith, so on. These were the fundamental doctrines of the Huguenots. Somebody said this: the Huguenots of France and the Puritans of the 17th century in England are not to be understood unless we remember always that they faced life with the temper that these doctrines gave them. They were the chosen soldiers of God, fighting in a war where victory was certain. Well, these people were certainly in a war, and if they didn't believe in the sovereignty of God and the fact that God will win, Calvin's motto, and the certainty that truth and right would triumph over evil, they would never have survived. Their fight was going to be long. Another aspect we may mention at the beginning is this: the ordering of the church, the way the church was governed, was by a consistory. And this consistory was made up of six ministers and 12 laymen. 6 ministers and 12 laymen. So we know that the majority were laymen in the ruling body of the church. And this cooperation of laymen in the life of the church was, and is, if you like, a distinguishing feature of Calvinism. And there's so much you could say about that if you were to branch out into the political and social world as well as the religious world. Anyway, the Huguenots at this point were challenging the church, the crown, and the parliament, and one of the most respected, influential universities in the world. So they had a great fight on their hands. Now it's said that Calvin's Institutes 1560 were dedicated to King Francis. This is how it begins. For the most mighty and illustrious monarch Francis, most Christian king of the French, his sovereign, John Calvin, craves peace and salvation in Christ. It's a noble way of beginning. And what it does, it makes a plea, you could say, for persecuted believers, persecuted evangelicals, persecuted Huguenots, whatever you like to call them. And it was a refutation, it was rejecting the claim that the reformers or Huguenots were going against the teachings of the church fathers. That was part of his argument. And then it was an appeal to the king to recognize truth over custom. Think, King Francis, what we're speaking of is truth. And we question whether some of the customs of the church are right. Then it was an appeal, of course, to Scripture as the final authority in these matters. It was a rejection also of the claim that the Reformation was causing tumults and disturbances in society and so on. And it was an appeal to the king also to beware of believing false charges that are made against the Reformed churches and hence, and as a result of that, being punishers, guilty of punishing the innocent. So all these things were there in that preface and that presentation, that argument. Now, we also need to bear in mind something on the political line here again, that the French kings at this time were really in disputes with the Austro-Spanish powers, and they'd aligned themselves with the Protestants of Germany. So there's a strange alliance here of Catholic France and Protestant Germany. And so there is that tension. And King Francis has to balance that tension of being on the one hand in alliance with Protestant Germany, and on the other hand wanting to keep in the good books of the Pope in Rome at that time, Louis X. This was a very, very important link politically and regarding the church and his position. So he had to balance these two opposite forces. Now, at this time, some, you may say, fanatic or perhaps very unwise individual managed to produce a whole load of handbills, strongly worded handbills, criticizing, saying that the Mass was, if we were to use the words of the 39 Articles, a blasphemous fable, a French version of that sort of accusation. And this fellow posted up these handbills, as it were, all over Paris, and he even somehow had the audacity to post one onto the door of the bedchamber of King Francis. Now this was it caused tremendous uproar, and Francis felt himself in a difficult position. So what he did was this. He called what he described as a great expiatory procession. There's going to be a great procession of all the papal visual things that you could see, you know what I mean, the candles and beads and priests and bishops and so on, all parading through the streets of Paris. And this was in 1535. And as a climax of this expiatory procession, as it were, there were 6 Protestants burned at the stake there in public. And Francis made some very strong remarks, saying that he would cut off his own arm rather than it be infected with this poison, this teaching of the Huguenots. And trouble broke out in other parts of France, in towns of Merindol, Cambrai. Massacres took place as a result of this. 22 towns were involved in it. In one town where there were some French Waldensians living, again, they were massacred. So it was a terrible affair that suddenly burst on the scene. Now, in the fullness of time, this King Francis I was succeeded by his son, Henry II. And he continued the same alliance with Germany, but at home in France, there was this determined effort to get rid of the Huguenots. But in spite of all that he did, the Huguenots, by the grace of God, continued to grow steadily. Protestant literature began to flow into the country from all directions, and all his efforts to stop it failed. He attempted to bring in a Spanish-style Inquisition into France, but some of the more enlightened members of the French Parliament blocked his move, so he wasn't able to do it. Onto the scene at this point comes a man who's going to be very significant in this story. This is Admiral Coligny. And he had an idea of getting, and he was sympathetic, he was a Huguenot at one point. He had an idea of taking Huguenots to Brazil. They could be taken over there and be safe and build up their communities in that land far away from France. And that was his idea. But that scheme was wrecked by a man by the name of Huguenot. Interestingly, I ran this past a Frenchman living today that I knew well to try and get all my French pronunciations right. But he said, Huguenot, he said, that name is still held in great contempt as a wretch, a traitor and not a very nice fellow, even today, apparently in some quarters of France. So he must have been something of a villain indeed. But in spite of all these efforts, the Huguenots would meet sometimes in Paris, in the center of Paris, in great numbers and sing together the psalms and so on in the face of all this persecution. That must have been quite an experience to see these people, possibly hundreds of them, even thousands, singing the psalms at that point. And they also at this point held their first national synod of the Huguenot Church. They did that annually, but they weren't always able to do it. Now, this King Henry II was killed in a tournament and was succeeded by his son Francis II. We have to go through these kings because it keeps the chronology of it working out. Now, this Francis II was only 16 years old when he became king, and he was weak, as described, sickly, a weak and sickly boy who only ruled in name. But he was married to somebody we will have heard of, Mary Queen of Scots. So these two are there together. Now, it's a brief reign, really. During that reign, another atrocity took place. There was a member of the French Parliament, a lady. She's described as being distinguished for her ability and singular purity and excellence of character. Very highly thought of. And she was found to be a Huguenot, and she was publicly executed for that terrible crime. Now this caused a lot of trouble and so on. But anyway, this short reign of this King Francis II, he couldn't really rule. And so two uncles, French uncles of Mary Queen of Scots, really took over the leadership of the country. These two were Charles, the Cardinal of Lorraine, and Francis, the Duke of Guise. This family, the Guises, are going to come into the story in a big way soon. These two were bitter enemies of the Huguenots. The Duke of Guise put himself as the head of the army, and the Cardinal of Lorraine put himself as the head of the government. So from all quarters, the Huguenots have got some fierce enemies growing up. Now, eventually the king dies, but the Guises here are very anxious to hold on to power. This young king of 16 years of age was succeeded by Charles IX, who was only 10 years of age. So you've still got these two powerful individuals abroad. But there's also somebody else comes into the scene now. Because the mother of Charles IX, this is all very confusing, I know, but I hope you're following me. The brother of Charles IX was Catherine de Medici. We know about her, the famous Florentine family. And she claimed the right also to rule until her son reached the age of maturity. So you've got all these people vying for power, and they're all, one way or another, hostile to the Huguenots. Now, I might just add this here. There were many of the nobility of France that became Huguenots. They weren't just the ordinary, everyday people. They were ordinary, everyday people, many of them, but some very high-ranking people joined the ranks of the Huguenots. And one that comes in to the scene at this point is Henry of Navarre. Henry of Navarre, you may have heard of him. He's celebrated in Macaulay's great poem, Ivry. Now glory to the Lord of hosts, from whom all glories are, and glory to our sovereign liege, King Henry of Navarre. And so you say, well, who is this fellow? Well, down in the very southern part of France, almost on the Spanish border, there is this little kingdom. Suppose it's almost like Wales to the rest of Britain. And it had its own king, and he was this man, King Henry of Navarre. Now, here he is now at this scene, a Huguenot and a supporter of the Huguenots. There is great tension at this time still between the House of Guise and Catherine de Medici. But this man, King Henry of Navarre, is now in the fray. So there's these powerful people now who are there. Now, Catherine of Medici, she tries to mediate, to lessen the tension that was there. And she sees to it that Huguenots are allowed in the daytime to worship outside the towns. That was a very generous thing she did. And so they were allowed to meet in the daytime outside the towns, particularly on the Lord's Day. But the Duke of Guise was very hostile to this, and passing through a certain town named Vézy, he found 1,000 Huguenots worshipping in and outside of a barn. Must have been a huge barn. And he had the whole lot massacred. It was a terrible atrocity again that was brought about at this time. Now this young king, Charles IX, he reigned for another 14 years, but still remained under the influence of his mother, Catherine de' Medici. There was an act in 1570 whereby, again, a little bit more toleration was given to the Huguenots. And it turned out that this man, Charles IX, and this mother, Catherine of Medici, got onto better terms with the Huguenots. And the leader of the Huguenots at that point was Admiral Gaspar Coligny. And he becomes a kind of a prime minister of France, a man of great influence anyway. And things improved to such a degree that the Protestant Henry of Navarre, that we mentioned a few moments ago, ended up marrying Marguerite de Valois, who was the youngest sister of the king then, Henry IX. So we've come now through all kinds of difficulties to the point where one of the great Huguenot leaders is marrying the sister of the king, who is on the opposite side. Now, this wedding was to take place 18th of August 1572 in the great Cathedral of Notre Dame. You will have heard of it. Now, for some reason, the ceremony took place outside. If anybody knows why that was, there was all sorts of reasons why it could have been, but it was actually held outside, and I can't get to the bottom of exactly why that was the case. Anyway, things are going now nicely. But again, into the story pops up again this villain, the Duke of Guise. And he insinuates a doubt into the mind of Catherine de' Medici that this Admiral Gaspar Coligny is really tricking her. He's leading her up the garden path. There's something not quite genuine about him. And this is playing on her mind. And what she does in the end, she organizes that a thug, as is described in the history books, goes into the quarters. This is just after the wedding has taken place, a few days after. A thug breaks into the quarters of Admiral Coligny and assassinates him. Well, with the end of him. But as it happened, the assassination failed. He was only wounded. He was still alive. And to make matters worse, the king at that time, Charles IX, who had come to like him, he sent immediately his doctor to attend to him and protect him and all this. And now Catherine de' Medici is alarmed that all her plotting and scheming is going to come out into the open, and she'll be deposed or worse, and everything's gone terribly wrong. So in a panic, she organizes with the Duke of Guise that which has come to be known as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, 22nd of August 1572. And this terrible massacre took place of all Huguenots that were there in France. I should have said, having killed the fellow, his body was thrown out of the window and terribly abused at the start of this massacre. Anyway, it's estimated that some say 20,000 people in Paris were put to the sword, others say 60,000, and it spread throughout Paris. But we must hurry on. At this point, you've still got the King of France, who now is Henry III at this point. And this king is beset with intrigues. There are three Henrys on the scene at this point. There's the king, now Henry III. There is this Henry, Duke of Guise, the villain of the piece. And there is still Henry of Navarre, who is still in a good position. Henry the Duke of Guise founds at this point the Catholic League, and it has a motto: one faith, one law, one king. It was very much the outlook of that time. Anyway, the first Henry, the King Henry III, is assassinated by, as it says, a demented monk. But before he died, before he expired, he said that Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot, is really technically the next in line to be the king. So that had been said. And in the fullness of time, Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot, becomes the king of France. Now, he is in a terrible dilemma at this point, because people are telling him, and he knows himself in his heart of hearts, that if he tries to rule France as a Huguenot, there will be a rebellion. It won't succeed. It won't happen. And he is advised to become a Roman Catholic. Now, what would you do then? Well, he did become a Roman Catholic, so we can't really commend him for that. But what he does is, as soon as he becomes king, he signs a document that had been drawn up the year before by a famous Huguenot called Du Plessis-Mornay, and it came to be called the Edict of Nantes, 1589, whereby it gave total freedom to the Huguenots in every respect. The Edict of Nantes, 1589. And so it was signed, so it was done, so it was passed. And he remained as a Catholic, but he had given total freedom to the Huguenots. Now this was setting free in a remarkable way. We all know that the Huguenots were incredibly industrious individuals, and they find themselves in prominent positions. It's said that industry, agriculture, and the trade of France prospered at this period. They were into such businesses as textile production, and paper production, iron, printing, beautiful designs, wonderful craftsmanship came from their workshops and so on. Many of them became leading lawyers, doctors and writers. I'm reading all this. And they were described, even by their enemies, as the thriftiest, hardest working and the most intelligent of the king's subjects. It was a great flowering, a blessing. One man, who again my French friend said is still remembered in France, was, if I pronounce it right, is Sully. He was a Huguenot financier. At the same time he was an engineer. At the same time he was an agriculturist. At the same time a military advisor and politician. And he set in motion in France a complete rebuilding of France's infrastructure. Build bridges, roads, hospitals, schools, fortifications, the canal system that you find over there. He set that up. He established postal service, new agricultural methods, double the productive area of farmland in France, ended the policy of deforestation, saw the planting of thousands of trees, gave support to new industrial techniques, personally organized the rebuilding of the city of Paris, etc., etc. A remarkable man. And you would think there would be no turning back for the Huguenots at this point. Henry IV now was succeeded by his son. Henry IV, by the way, was our Huguenot leader. That's what he became when he became king. He was succeeded by Louis XIII, who now starts to persecute the Huguenots again. We've heard of the sieges of Rochelle, and these all begin at this point. We'll say something more about that in a minute. Now, on the wider picture, and I mustn't go into this, throughout many countries of Europe began now what was called the 30 Years' War. That, in some ways, was confined within those areas, used to be called the Holy Roman Empire. Anyway, France becomes involved in that. Cardinal Richelieu is the king's advisor. He actually advises the king not to persecute the Huguenots, but to concentrate on the war. Richelieu wasn't a good man, because we'll see his villainy later on. But at this point, he did advise the king not to challenge the Huguenots, fight the war. It was a kind of a religious war between Protestants and Catholics. That wasn't the whole business of it, but it did have that aspect. But it ended 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, which granted toleration for Lutherans and Calvinists. However, just prior to the end of the war, you get another French king. This is perhaps the most notorious and dangerous of them all as far as the Huguenots were concerned. Louis XIV comes to the throne 1643. He's known as the Sun King, and he is what you might call an absolute monarch of absolute monarchs. And he insists on the total control of every aspect of the country's life, including the church. And this begins now most severe persecution, should say, for the Huguenots. All their liberties have been cancelled. He argued that there were no Huguenots left, so he might as well not have a law protecting them, because they don't exist. Well, a total lie, obviously, but that's the way he presented it. Now, he's cancelled the Edict of Toleration, and as a result, something in the region of 200,000 Huguenots left the country. There was no restriction on them leaving the country at this point, but that is to come. And many nations round about, Protestant nations, received them. Switzerland was one, Holland was another, Denmark was another. Sweden, strangely, was less hospitable. I don't know why. Russia let them in, and England and Ireland took really the largest numbers. We'll go into that in a minute. So now you've got the Huguenots fleeing the country because of this. And remember, all those skills, with all that expertise that they held, that they had, was all being lost. It's said that, I'll put it in here, something like 50,000 came to England and 10,000 came to Ireland. And again, bringing all these trades and this genius really with them. Silversmiths, weavers, linen workers, lace makers, clock makers, and so on. And they come they come really all over the place. But I've got down here London, Barnstaple, Bristol, Canterbury, Dover, Exeter, Norwich, Southampton, Winchester, the North East, East Anglia, the Midlands, and so on. I don't know whether any came to Salisbury, but maybe they did. But there it is. They did amazing things. I had down that they helped to drain 40,000 acres of fenland in East Anglia, and so on. But what about those that couldn't get out? Because after a while, it was restricted. You weren't supposed to escape, and there were dire consequences if you were caught. One example was women. There is a record. The tower still stands, apparently, and it stands in the town of Aigues-Mortes, if I pronounced it right. And it's a tower in which recalcitrant Huguenot women were put, and they were there really until they died, basically. But the story is of one woman, a young woman called Marie Durand, who was imprisoned in that tower in her teens. Don't quite know the precise date, but her teens, and she was held in that place for 38 years. 38 years, imagine that, a young woman. And apparently she would write on the wall of that tower, chalk or whatever she had, scratch on the wall, resistor, resistor, resist, resist, resist. And that's what these people were doing. Now, they were like that. I just want to say now, there were three major influxes of Huguenots into England or Britain over the years, and it just helps you to see how long this persecution went on for. Now, the first influx took place in the reign of Edward VI. So we're talking about the 16th century, mid-16th century. And they came mainly in those times to London. Austin Friars, the church in Austin Friars was given over to them to hold their services. Queen Elizabeth I very much welcomed them to come here, and areas such as Deal and Sandwich down on the south coast was very much benefited by their coming. If I have time, I'll tell you why. Rye, down there on the south coast, received a great lot of them. There's a record here of the Mayor of Rye writing for help to Lord Cecil in London. He says this, I'll give you a little excerpt from the letter. May it please your honour to be advertised, to be made known, that the 3rd day of the present month, 12 of the clock, there arrived a boat from Dieppe with Frenchmen, women and children, to the number of 500 persons, and we be in great want of corn for their and our sustentation, by reason the country adjoining is barren. Also it may please your honour, after night and this day is come 2 ships of Dieppe into this haven full of many people. And so there are many stories like that about this particular time. And including, it says, including gentlemen, merchants, doctors, ministers of religion, students, schoolmasters, tradesmen, mechanics, metalworkers, artisans, shipwrights, mariners, potters, glassmakers, smiths, brewers, hat makers, dyers, carpenters, millers and labourers. All these skills were now pouring into England. I could say a great deal about the time of Elizabeth I and what was going on then at that particular point. They also brought into the country other benefits. Apparently, they started off the growing of hops in Kent. I don't know if that's right, you Kentish men or men of Kent, but that's what it says. And cabbages. I think we probably did have cabbages, but it increased by their coming, the growing of cabbages and carrots and celery. In Great Yarmouth, the people of Yarmouth bought their fish from Holland until the Huguenots came, and then they started fishing for the fish themselves and things like this. It really did change the whole nation in a very profitable and good way. I have much I could say about that. I'm missing out some of these. Of course, you could have their influence even in government. We would have to go now to the second migration that comes about at the end of the 17th century. And it's well known that the governor of the Bank of England at that time, the Bank of England was formed in the 1690s, and the governor at that time was a Huguenot, and so on. They took great part in William of Orange's army, and so on. And the commander of the army was Louis de Ligonier, a Huguenot again. And even in recent times we had a Huguenot commander of the army, Sir Peter de la Billière. That's not very long ago. And so you could just go on with all the things that they did. Denis Papin became the curator of the Royal Society. He was experimented in steam engines, even at that early date, and so on. The state coach, William III, or William of Orange state coach, was made by a Huguenot, which is now still in use as the coach of the Speaker of the House of Commons. So they had a tremendous impact. You probably used Roget's Thesaurus. There's another Huguenot contribution. Walter Delamere, you may have delighted in his poetry. And again, well, I won't give you any more, but they're there. Now, these were coming in the second migration, many of these. But then you have a third migration much later on. Going to miss all that out. There's a very useful list that was you can find in the writings of the Christian Institute of the way that this growing persecution was meted out. I'll just hastily go through this. First of all, this is how they gradually closed in on these people, and it's much to say to the present time. First of all, re-education of the youngsters. Books were published arguing that France should only have one religion. Priests were sent out to win back Protestants on their deathbeds. Re-education of children. Second, inducements to conform. From 1676, people were offered financial incentives to convert back to Catholicism. Within 3 years, the number of certified converts had reached 10,000. 3, repressive restrictions. Huguenots were only allowed to bury their dead at night, and no more than 12 were able to meet to celebrate a wedding. 4, suppression of education. Huguenot schools were banned from teaching all but the bare minimum of reading and writing. 5, they were banned from certain professions. They were not allowed to become lawyers. And strangely, a woman could not become a linen draper. No idea why that was. 6, religious discrimination. Huguenot pastors were accused of breaking the blasphemy laws. Hence, they were often forbidden to preach. Churches and schools were torn down, I should say. 7, intrusion into the family. Children not baptized into the Roman Church could be removed from their parents and raised as Catholics once they had reached the age of 7. Imagine that. 8, armed violence. From 1681, armed forces were billeted with Protestant families, and these soldiers put into your house and encouraged to be as untidy and awkward and difficult and dirty as they possibly could be. And 9, immigration, fleeing the country, was forbidden, and if you were caught, if you were a man, you were sent to the galleys. If you were a woman, you were incarcerated in a nunnery. So that was the sort of way that they clamped down. Now, you go right into the 18th century, 1724, still restrictions were put on these people. And I'm cutting it short now. You come right up to the time of the French Revolution, when everything breaks down and people have no time to persecute the Huguenots and so on. And so they gain in strength at that time, in spite of the horrible things that were going on around them. After that comes Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon Bonaparte, though he's makes and creates a totalitarian state, nevertheless, he gives freedom of religion. And so he gives freedom to Roman Catholics and Huguenots. And moreover, he pays the priests and the pastors' salaries. And this goes on in France right into the 19th century. So some relaxation under Napoleon, and then there's the return of the Bourbons after Napoleon, who changed sides by now. Earlier they were pro-Huguenots, by now they're not. So there was a little bit of persecution at the beginning of the 19th century, but in 1859 they celebrated their tercentenary, and really nobody bothered with them or opposed them as they did that. And by 1905, the French state separated itself from all religious bodies, including Roman Catholics and Protestants, and so they were free completely. The end of the 19th century, liberalism affected the Huguenots, but you still had sound people like Theodore Monod and so on amongst them. And they did issue a statement which was very orthodox towards the end of the 19th century. But I won't read that now. All we can say is, hastening to a conclusion, is that it was remarkable the way that they continued over all these centuries of persecution. And they were being forced, really, put into a straitjacket. You must believe this. This is the body of truth and experience, and you're supposed to hold by. They weren't tolerated, and we all know about the lack of toleration that is growing ever in our own countries at this particular time. So these men are an example of the way that God can sustain and keep his people in the most appalling situations. And they're a warning to us of what can happen unless we're vigilant and hold fast to that faith once given to the saints.